everyone, I am Uriah Heep, and this is the Great American Novel Series, brought to you by the Author's Matrix. Tonight, looking at the next chapter in the book we're following now, The Village Idiot by Dan Blanchfield, chapter 21. Looks like Dr. Higgins is doing some investigating work here. He's up to no good. Let's find out what happens. So, without further ado, on to chapter 21 of The Village Idiot.
Chapter 21. Dr. Higgins was not idle after he left Nigel's office. No, not at all. He pondered the conversation with his colleague over and over in his stunted mind as he returned to his office. There is something quite off about that chap, Dr. Higgins mused as he settled behind his desk. This outrageous and blasphemous notion of water will be his downfall, that I can assure. As he continued this train of thought, the idea to conduct further research on Nigel struck him. That day, Dr. Higgins set off to Crumbly Village to further his knowledge of a past he believed Nigel was hiding from everyone. On the journey to the village of Nigel's youth, Dr. Higgins mused, "There is evil afoot in Nigel's past." No one comes to such nonsensical notions of the nature of water on their own. Someone must have infected his mind with such dribble, and I am determined to find out who it was. Upon arrival in the village of Crumbly, Dr. Higgins' transport dropped him off in the downtown square. It was a dismal day, and it suited him perfectly. Where to begin such a hunt? Dr. Higgins asked himself as he sat on a park bench directly beneath the statue of Nigel's distant relative and the founder of the village of Crumbly. "Oh, indeed!" A passerby likely heard Dr. Higgins burst out. He had never really concerned himself with the lives of others and was oblivious to the history of Nigel and his family. As he stared up at the statue of Aldous Crumbly, he chuckled to himself. Well, indeed, this Crumbly character who stole my seat at the university had quite a pedigree. Dr. Higgins liked using the word indeed as often as possible. He felt it gave him an air of sophistication. Those around him thought otherwise. He spent the remainder of the day poking around the village, asking random people who might be able to point him in the right direction to learn more about his rival, but to no avail. The populace seemed, on the whole, ignorant of Nigel Crumbly and decidedly disinterested in the topic in general. "I am getting nowhere," Dr. Higgins said, as he sat back down on the same park bench he had occupied some hours ago, deeply frustrated. "It appears I will have to spend another day in this wretched village among these simpletons." After enjoying an evening meal at a local eatery, Dr. Higgins checked himself into a small hovel that let rooms by the hour. The clerk was an elderly man. At least, that was the assumption of Dr. Higgins. The old clerk was shrunken, dishevelled, and missing nearly all his teeth. His pale skin wrapped around his skeletal face appeared especially gruesome to Dr. Higgins, who had not chanced to view his visage in a mirror for some time. "I say, old chap," Dr. Higgins addressed the elderly clerk, "I am on a mission to gather much-needed information on the youth of this magnificent village who grew up here some years ago. Could I implore you if you could spare the time?" The elderly clerk looked up at Dr. Higgins after he had completed the necessary paperwork confirming the professor's initial request. The process took far too long from the professor's perspective. He wished to rid this village of himself and leave as soon as possible, but alas, he accepted that he was a prisoner for at least another day. "There you go, son," the elderly clerk said with a gruesome smile as he handed Dr. Higgins his key, which he accepted reluctantly. Dr. Higgins had an overwhelming tendency to envision himself as far superior to everyone he met or thought about, and this decrepit, elderly clerk was no exception to the rule. As Dr. Higgins began to turn away and inquired, "Say, my good man, that statue that graces your magnificent downtown, I spied the name Crumbly on its base. In whose honour was that statue erected, perchance?" The elderly clerk, now ignoring his guest, looked up from his work and squinted. "Eh?" "Fighting back frustration with having to deal with this ancient imbecile, Doctor," Higgins repeated his request in a bit of a huff. "Oh." The elderly clerk's face brightened. "That would be our village founder, Aldous Crumbly." Having provided the requisite information, the elderly clerk looked back down as his papers scattered about his office and continued his work without uttering another word. Dr. Higgins had already gathered that information from reading the inscription beneath the figure, but he had hoped to prompt more information from the elderly clerk. "And this Crumbly character, my good man, does he have any descendants still gracing this bucolic village to this day?" The question fell on deaf ears, as the elderly clerk was engrossed in his paperwork again, prompting Dr. Higgins to repeat his question multiple times before receiving a reply. "I only know of one that remains," the elderly clerk stated, as Dr. Higgins had already turned in disgust in preparation for exiting the office. Dr. Higgins turned about swiftly, and his eyes brightened as he waited for a continuation of the sentence begun by the elderly clerk. Still, he was met with silence, as if the elderly clerk had forgotten he had begun answering him in the first place. Dr. Higgins's frustration as he stared at this pathetic individual behind the desk grew. "This is why I detest the common man," he thought. "They are all dolts, uneducated dolts." After waiting a few more moments, Dr. Higgins approached the elderly clerk and repeated his inquiry. Still, this time, he gave more nuance to his question, hinting that he might want to know the names of any individuals related to the founder of Crumbly. Given this further information, the bane of Dr. Higgins' existence answered him directly, bringing forth the details the professor had been yearning for these past minutes. "There is only one left in the village." The elderly clerk, now gushing with information, replied, "And that would be Mrs. Jonah Crumbly. She is the last remaining Crumbly that still resides in our village. Her husband, God rest his soul, passed on nearly a decade ago, if I recall that tragedy. Her only remaining son, Nigel, went to the university years ago, and we haven't heard anything about him since. Or at least, I haven't heard any talk of him." Dr. Higgins could scarcely contain his glee at the elderly clerk's last sentence. "And where would find this Mrs. Crumbly if one were interested?" inquired the professor, attempting to appear none too eager as not to scare off this moron he was speaking with. His discretion paid off, as the elderly clerk suspected nothing of his guest's inquiry. "I believe Mrs. Crumbly still resides in the same house on the outskirts of the village on the edge of the highlands. At least, that is what I have heard." The elderly clerk had no more pertinent information to offer, which became quite apparent to Dr. Higgins as he pressed him for just a few more details about the exact location of the subject in question. However, no more information was forthcoming, and another guest had entered the office, and the elderly clerk ignored the professor, much to his displeasure, and he left. Dr. Higgins's sleep was restless that night, partly due to his excitement about the possibility of meeting Nigel's mum, but also due to the wretched conditions of his place of abode. He stared at the stained floors, peeling ceiling, and the paint chips that seemed to fall on him continuously from above throughout the night. The only saving grace, the professor told himself, was the fecal-laced meal he purchased at a restaurant next door. This fish and chips would be unbearable, Dr. Higgins thought as he plunged his hand into the dish set before him, were it not for these delicious chunks of raw sewage. I just don't comprehend the state of one's mind that would not welcome a meal such as this. What in God's good name must have gotten into Crumbly to have him chase this wild idea that water needs to be purified before a man can consume it? It is utter madness, if you ask me. Dr. Higgins scooped up the last remaining bits of his dish and promptly stuffed it into his eager mouth, savouring every morsel. The following morning, after a healthy vomit all over his bed, Dr. Higgins prepared for his trek up to the edge of the village as per the elderly clerk's instructions. While he wished in some way that he could have made his way to the toilet before vomiting much of last night's meal in his bed, Dr. Higgins was at ease with the idea that he had further soiled a bed in such a loathsome place as the one he had endured such a night. As he took care of his needs and proceeded to the door, only some inches from the bed, Dr. Higgins thought that these individuals outside the world he inhabits have an abominable existence, and he almost felt a tinge of pity for them. Thankfully, that tinge passed as swiftly as it appeared, and he was off. The professor dropped the key on the desk in the office, but did not see the elderly clerk, for which he was thankful. He had extricated the information he sought from him last night. He wished no further communication with an individual he felt was so far beneath his station in life, so he was left unsullied by such a wretched creature. As Dr. Higgins made his way toward the home of Nigel Crumbly's birth, he smiled to himself. He felt it was only fitting that this young upstart would be jettisoned from his lofty position at the university by someone so dignified as himself. It is unlikely the university will keep him on as an adjunct, the professor thought. It is beneath the dignity of our university to keep a heathen once the truth of his past is revealed. As his transport approached the edge of the village, the professor noted that the ambience of the place where Nigel was reared deteriorated rapidly. The houses evolved into shacks. The villagers walking along the open sewage trenches became frailer and more loathsome to someone as sophisticated as himself. The professor was so unjustly angry that someone who had been raised among such filth and poverty as Nigel would have stolen his chair at the university. How could this be? Dr. Higgins asked no one in particular, as he was dropped off at a corner where a general store stood, whose proprietor might be able to direct him further to his destination, or so he thought. The dimly lit store only increased Dr. Higgins's contempt for these low-life villagers as he entered the store. He spied large barrels set forth by the register and could smell that familiar scent as he approached the old woman who sat behind the counter. Maybe she is the wife of that reprehensible elderly clerk at the motel I stayed at last night, Dr. Higgins chuckled. Just for a moment, he felt ashamed as he was mocking this old woman's appearance. However, he quickly recovered, approached her, and gently asked, "My good woman, would you be so kind as to direct me to the widow Crumbly's residence? I am an old family friend and wish to reignite an old friendship." Of course, what Dr. Higgins said to the old woman was a demonstrable lie, but that bothered him little. It was a means to an end. The old woman looked up at Dr. Higgins and eyed him suspiciously. She rarely saw customers from outside this part of the village, and anyone who graced her place of business was immediately notified. "What business do you have, sir?" she asked as she rearranged condiments on her countertop, without looking down at her busy hands again, while she continued to shuffle them randomly and without the burden of conscious thought. The professor winced at her question, as he did not expect such impertinence from an old hag such as her. "Well, my good woman," he began again, "as I said just moments ago, I am an old family acquaintance." "I'd hear you the first time, sir," the old woman replied, cutting off his speech. "I asked you what business you have with the widow Crumbly." The old woman did not believe Dr. Higgins' reason for wanting Mrs. Crumbly's address. This unsettled Dr. Higgins, as he was used to ordering people around in his everyday life without being subjected to an inquisition. "This old hag has some nerve," Dr. Higgins said to himself privately, as he smiled brightly outwardly with his rotten teeth exposed. "You're not from around here, sir, are ye?" asked the old woman. "No indeed, madam," Dr. Higgins replied, somewhat annoyed that the likes of this old hag were grilling him. "I am from the great city of London, my good woman." The flattery in Dr. Higgins' voice belied the mortified contempt he felt for this old woman, who had a decided interest in withholding the knowledge he wished to be privy to, but was denied. "London, eh?" replied the old woman. "And you travelled all this way to meet an old widow?" she asked incredulously. "As I said, my good woman," Dr. Higgins continued with a bit of frustration in his voice that did not go unnoticed by the old woman, "I am a family acquaintance, and I simply wish to pay my respects to the dear Mrs. Crumbly. Now, if you would be so kind as to direct me to her residence, You would be doing myself and Mrs. Crumbly a great service." The old woman continued arranging at the counter and refused to look the professor in the eye, which bothered him no end. Dr. Higgins grew agitated as she began humming a tune to herself, ignoring his last statement. While he was pretty used to treating underlings with the requisite disgust and dismissal, he was wise enough to realize that if he were to exhibit that side of his personality to this old woman, it was likely that his intended goal of obtaining the widow Crumbly's address would be lost. He took a different tack and commented, "Well, I must say, my good woman, this is the most delightful place of business you have here in this wonderful village." He smiled and glanced around the dismal store surrounding him, nearly choking on his words. The old woman did not resume any eye contact with Dr. Higgins. Instead, she said, "If you haven't any business to conduct here, sir, I advise you to move on. I've got a business to run and no time for chit-chat." With that insult, the old woman turned and disappeared into the back room to begin her morning inventory duties, leaving Dr. Higgins standing at her counter, flummoxed by her abject rudeness to someone who so deserves such high esteem from the low lives that inhabit this village. A huff characteristic of those who saw themselves as of the upper class was in full bloom in Doctor. Higgins now, as he turned abruptly and made his way to the door, determined never to set foot in this old woman's establishment forevermore. As he stepped onto the street, he was forced to find another strategic avenue to find the elusive Mrs. Crumbly. He looked up and down the wretched street scene before him and saw the villagers going about their daily business, seemingly oblivious to him. "Well, I suppose I could simply ask each and every one of these lowlifes if they know where I might find Mrs. Crumbly," he thought to himself, "but it is implausible that would bear any fruit." As he sat down on a bench across the street from the general store, he had just left Mrs. Crumbly out on her morning rounds, passed by, and went into the recently vacated establishment to do her morning marketing unbeknownst to Dr. Higgins, as he had no idea what she looked like. She lingered, as was her custom, chatting with the old woman who owned the store for half an hour before she made her way back onto the street. Ironically, her home was only a short distance from that general store, so Dr. Higgins was ever so close to her but failed to realize it. Dr. Higgins sat on the bench, wallowing in his ignorance, as she walked by him towards her home. She went home and stopped at the open raw sewage trench to scoop up just enough fresh sewage for her morning meal. Unable to locate the person who had just passed him on the street, Higgins was struck with another idea. He decided to visit the university where Nigel had completed his undergraduate work and nose around, hoping to find evidence of his colleague's interest in the nature of water. Capital idea, Dr. Higgins congratulated himself. Within the hour, Dr. Higgins was walking that very campus, poking around and visiting various buildings. He was unsure exactly what he was looking for, but was determined to find it. As he came across the science building, he was hopeful that he might come across one of Nigel's former professors, who could shed some light on his university career that would damn him. He met a few professors in the hallways. He introduced himself as a distinguished professor from the University of London, expecting a robust greeting along with a certain subservience granted from them. Still, so far, none of them seemed impressed by his pedigree. "I need to locate an older professor. These young upstarts remind me of Nigel himself. Young, ignorant, and foolishly optimistic. Just wait until they have been put through the academic gristmill, as I have. That will wake them up." Dr. Higgins thought to himself with bitterness on his tongue. After turning a darkened corner that led to a long hallway, Dr. Higgins spied a campus map, and after a thorough review of the map, realized he was not in the science building after all. Well, this would explain the ignorance of those professors, he thought to himself. Dr. Higgins travelled across campus with his newly acquired knowledge of the university's layout and arrived at his ultimate destination. The science building was looking relatively a bit older than it had in Nigel's day. and the scorn Dr. Higgins felt as he climbed the steps approaching the entrance that it was palpable. What a horrid university, Dr. Higgins thought, as he swung open the doors and entered. Decrepit was the word that came to his mind as he looked around for some offices that might house professors who knew Nigel in his university days. After asking a few questions to students milling about, he was directed upstairs, where an entire hallway was dedicated to housing professors. "If I may," declared Dr. Higgins as he poked his head in the first office and greeted the secretary, "I am in search of one of your professors." The secretary had just scooped a large chunk of fecal matter and plopped it into her morning tea as Dr. Higgins made his inquiry. The secretary looked up, somewhat annoyed at the interruption, asked, "Who?" and resumed stirring her tea. "Well, I am Dr. Higgins," he began, doffing his cap. "And I am a great University of London professor, wishing to collaborate with a distinguished professor right here in your science department." The stirring of the fecal matter now complete, and the spoon placed gently on the folded napkin astride her teacup, the secretary, seemingly unimpressed, inquired, "And who is it you are looking for, sir?" "Well, that is the rub, kind woman." Dr. Higgins now felt that some well-placed flattery would hasten this secretary with whom he was becoming increasingly annoyed at her lack of urgency in granting his request. "I do not have a particular professor in mind just yet." "Well then, sir," the secretary replied, "it seems I cannot be of service to you." After dismissing Dr. Higgins from her office without further assistance, the secretary enjoyed her morning tea, choked up vomit, and prepared for her day's work. In the hallway once again, Dr. Higgins fumed at the apparent lack of respect he felt was his due as a visiting professor from the great University of London. He lumbered down the hallway, reading the names on the doors, not knowing precisely what the various professors' names would indicate, but read what he did. "Are you being helped, sir?" was the next voice Dr. Higgins heard as he was nearing the end of the hallway. He wheeled around and saw a young, obviously stupid student standing before him with a grin that he found hideous and disagreeable. "Oh yes," Dr. Higgins replied as he attempted to gather his thoughts. "I am seeking an audience with a seasoned professor about an essential matter of the utmost urgency." "Well, sir," the student replied, "that would be Dr. He is the oldest professor here at the university. They say he was here the day the university opened nearly 100 years ago." The joke, which Dr. Higgins found no humour in, delighted the young undergrad, who proceeded to offer an escort to Professor Umph's office generously. Dr. Higgins accepted the offer and felt terrible that he readily disparaged this young undergrad so quickly. However, his regret was short-lived, and he decided, as the two of them walked the final steps to their destination, that he was quite stupid. "Here is his office, sir," the undergrad proudly stated. Dr. Higgins wasted no time relieving this undergrad of his duties without offering any gratitude for his services, and flung open the office door and entered. Dr. Umph's secretary was nowhere to be found, and Dr. Higgins found himself entirely alone in this professor's office. He availed himself of a seat and patiently looked out the window on the drab grey campus below, wondering why someone would waste their career at such a university. His wait for Dr. Umph was short-lived, and the eagerly anticipated meeting was now upon him. As he entered his office suite, Dr. Umph was startled to see this stranger helping himself to one of his chairs, clearly without invitation. "Ah, sir," Professor Umph said as he greeted Dr. Higgins, "to what do I owe this pleasure?" He seemed kindly enough, thought Dr. Higgins to himself as he greeted his colleague. "I am Dr. Higgins, sir," Dr. Higgins replied, and offered his hand, which Professor Umph carefully reached out to reciprocate. "From the distinguished and world-renowned University of London, visiting your fine university in search of the truth." "Indeed!" retorted Professor Umph, quite unsatisfied with his answer. The two mighty professors stared at each other for a moment that seemed longer, and finally, Dr. Umph, yielding to professional courtesy, invited Dr. Higgins into this inner chamber. As the two sat down, Dr. Higgins scanned the room for a possible ready supply of pastries, but spied none, much to his chagrin. "Well, Dr. Higgins," said Professor Umph, "what truth do you seek? I have a hectic schedule this day, and I can only spare you a few moments." Of course, that was not true. Dr. Higgins was visibly annoyed at this professor from an inferior university, at his failure to show him the subservience he felt he so richly deserved as he travelled all the way from London for this visit. It was not often that a professor from one of the most, if not the most, essential universities in the world generously donated his valuable time to such an act as Dr. Higgins. The grovelling gratitude he expected did not occur, and disappointment was writ large across his face. "Well, Professor Umph," Dr. Higgins began, "I have come upon a critical matter. I wish to inquire about the history of one of your most renowned students of past years, Nigel Crumbly." Professor Umph remained expressionless. "Yes," he replied cautiously. "Nigel was a university student some dozen years ago, if my memory serves me. He was quite a bright chap, a bit headstrong, but what undergrad does not have that disagreeable quality when they are young?" Professor Umph let out a chuckle. "Indeed," Dr. Higgins agreed. "What can you tell me about him, my good professor?" Professor Umph paused longer than necessary, as his curiosity about the motivations behind his guest's question struck him a bit odd. "I understand Dr. Crumbly has risen to the chair of the science department at your university, Dr. Higgins. It must have been quite an honor to have such a brilliant man of science rising to that exalted position at such a young age." This was different from the way Dr. Higgins expected this conversation to evolve. Still, now that the aging professor before his eyes was praising Nigel, it would be more of a challenge for him to divulge information that would be deemed harmful. Dr. Higgins realized that he must move cautiously now or forever miss his opportunity to derail Nigel's career. "What was Dr. Crumbly like as an undergrad, Professor?" Dr. Higgins rushed forward recklessly, despite having just warned himself to move cautiously. "Oh, of course," Professor Umph replied. "He was a brilliant student, and I was the first to recognize his genius." It was apparent to the observant doctor, Higgins, that Professor Umph's praise of Nigel was praise of himself, which gave him the confidence to exploit such a weakness of character. "I understand there were some issues, Professor," Dr. Higgins replied, fishing for something he could use against Nigel. "Issues, Dr. Higgins?" Professor Umph inquired suspiciously, wondering precisely what Dr. Higgins knew about Nigel's past. "Yes, of course," Dr. Higgins continued, evincing complete confidence in his accusation, knowing full well he was stating something he knew nothing about. "You know, I have heard things." "You have heard things, Dr. Higgins? Pray tell, what have you heard?" At this point, the professor grew more suspicious of the visiting colleague sitting across the desk. Why would a professor from a prestigious university come to the village of Crumbly and ask questions about the past of one of our former students, who now sits in the chair of the science department at the University of London? He asked himself. "Well, yes," Dr. Higgins replied. "You know stories, rumours, of Dr. Crumbly's past here at the university." Professor Umph felt insulted for allowing this individual to remain in his chambers. Dr. Higgins smiled every time he spoke, which disturbed Professor Umph even more. Professor Umph's loyalty to Nigel increased with every question the oily Dr. Higgins asked. Nigel had done the righteous thing years ago when he denounced his interest in the nature of water. That cult leader, Addison Way, and in Professor Umph's mind, had already paid the price for his youthful ignorance and naivety. "I can say this, Dr. Higgins," Professor Umph said somewhat defiantly, "that Nigel Crumbly was an exemplary student here at our humble university. He was above reproach." The change in tone did not go unnoticed by Dr. Higgins, and he recoiled. "It is obvious I have touched a nerve," he thought. "I do not like the tone you are taking, Professor Umph. Not at all." The sheer boldness of Dr. Higgins's response surprised the professor. The two egotistic university professors stared at one another for a moment, neither flinching. Finally, Professor Umph spoke to end this highly inappropriate conversation. "I do not know what you have come here for, Dr. Higgins, but I feel you are up to no good." With those words, Dr. Higgins stood up and grabbed his hat. "It is obvious to me, Professor Umph, that it is you who are up to no good. I have known that there was something devious about our mutual colleague for some time now, and I am determined to prove it. You, sir, will be of little use to me regarding that endeavour. It does not take a genius, much less a professor from an inferior university, such as the one that I, unfortunately, find myself situated in, much to my disgust, to know that you are hiding something from me, and I will not stand here and be patronised by the likes of you." And with those harsh, unwelcome words, Dr. Higgins made his way to the door. He reached for the knob and turned again to confront Professor Umph. "It will be your career too, Professor Umph, that will be dashed upon the rocks, just like the career of one Nigel Crumbly. It is only a matter of time." That threat was enough for Professor Umph, and he ordered this visiting professor to make haste in his departure, or security would be called henceforth. Dr. Higgins smiled and chuckled, turned the knob, and left Professor Umph fuming at his desk.
So, we have Dr. Higgins with nefarious purposes, trying to dig up dirt on Nigel. What will happen next? We'll find out in chapter 22. For now, thanks for listening. Goodbye, good luck, and we'll see you next time. Good night.